Welcome to this information session on the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or in short, the CBAM, produced by the Climate Action Authority. This video provides an overview of what CBAM is, who it applies to, and what obligations importers and authorized CBAM declarants will have in the coming years. CBAM stands for the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It is a carbon price applied to certain goods produced outside the European Union and imported into the EU, so that these goods face a similar carbon cost to goods produced within the EU, which are already subject to the EU Emissions Trading System, the EU ETS1. The mechanism aims to prevent EU industries from relocating to third countries with less stringent emissions regulations and to preserve a level playing field between the EU and non-EU producers. In Malta, the Climate Action Authority is the competent authority responsible for implementing the CBAM. The CBAM is established by a regulation, the 2023-956, and it currently applies to selected carbon-intensive products listed in Annex 1 of the regulation. These product categories are cement, iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizers, and hydrogen and electricity. CBAM is being implemented in two phases. The transitional period ran from October 2023 to December 2025. And during this period, operators importing CBAM goods were required only to submit quarterly CBAM reports. There were no obligations to purchase or surrender certificates, and no verification was required. From the 1st of January 2026, the definitive period started. In this phase, only authorized CBAM declarants are allowed to import CBAM goods into the EU, and full obligations apply. That is, annual declarations, purchasing and surrendering CBAM certificates, and exposure to penalties in case of non-compliance. A key concept in CBAM is the 50 tons threshold. If an operator imports less than 50 tons of CBAM goods in a calendar year, that operator is exempt from CBAM obligations, with specific exceptions for hydrogen and electricity. Once the 50 tons threshold is reached or exceeded in a year, all CBAM goods imported in that year become subject to CBAM. This means they must be included in the annual CBAM declaration and covered by the purchase and surrender of certificates. From the 1st of April 2026, if an importer exceeds the 50 tons threshold without being authorized as a CBAM declarant, customs must block the import of CBAM goods and penalties may apply. The 50 tons threshold was determined so that around 99% of EU CBAM emissions are covered, and the European Commission will reassess this threshold every year by the 30th of April. In the next part of the presentation, we are going to walk through the process of becoming an authorized CBAM declarant. This flowchart is how an operator gains the authorized CBAM declarant status. At the end of 2025 and in the beginning of 2026, the main priority was that operators who expected to import CBAM goods were to complete the Climate Action Authority's pre-registration form and then submit an authorization application through the CBAM Registry. This is also known as the CBAM portal. Once the pre-registration is submitted, the Climate Action Authority processes the case and, if successful, grants access to the CBAM Registry. The operator then submits the online authorization application in the registry. And for those applications submitted by the 31st of March 2026, importers could continue importing CBAM goods provisionally using the application reference number and the tariff code Y238 in the customs declaration, pending acceptance or withdrawal of the authorization. Then, from the 1st of April 2026, there is no longer this derogation, so only authorized CBAM declarants may import CBAM goods over the 50 tons, and without authorization, imports will not be allowed. Once an application is approved, the operator becomes an authorized CBAM declarant and is assigned a CBAM account number. This number must be included in the customs declaration for CBAM goods together with the tariff code Y128. In 2027, finally, the first annual declaration and surrendering of certificates will occur. Other tariff codes apply in specific situations. For example, Code Y137 can be used when the importer expects to remain below the 50 tons threshold and hence will be exempt from the CBAM. And Code Y237 applies when CBAM goods originate in the EU. The authorization application includes several mandatory data fields, and these cover the name and address of the applicant, the EORI number, indirect representative status, if applicable, the AEO certificate details, again when applicable, the contact person details, declarations of honour confirming no serious infringements in the last 5 years, the financial data for the previous 3 calendar years, and estimated CBAM goods imports for the current year and the following year. Applicants must also upload supporting documents. A tax compliance certificate issued within the last 3 months by the Maltese Tax and Customs Administration is mandatory. The certificate must show no pending liabilities or liabilities which are covered by an agreement that is being honoured. If the tax compliance certificate shows significant outstanding liabilities without a valid agreement being honoured, the authority cannot grant authorization. And depending on the case, the Climate Action Authority may request additional documents, such as criminal records for the legal entity, management or beneficial owners, and financial statements. Some practical recommendations to ensure a smoother process are to enable email notifications in the registry, upload all mandatory documents, provide realistic import estimates, use description fields to clarify information, amend applications promptly when requested, and indirect customs representatives should ensure that their client's representation remains in place at least until September 2027, which is the end of the first definitive CBAM cycle. There are 2 possible outcomes. If an authorization is refused, the authority notifies the applicant and explains the reasons. The applicant then has 30 days to submit observations. If the application is approved, a CBAM account is created and the CBAM account number is assigned. Where an operator has been established for less than 2 years or where the authority identifies financial risk, a bank guarantee is required before activation. This guarantee must cover the potential certificates that may need to be surrendered in the coming 2 years. It must be provided within 30 days of the authority's request. It can be adjusted if import quantities change, and it must be renewed annually, and is released only after the 30th of September of the 2nd year, following the successful surrender of certificates. And now we're moving on to the next part, the 3rd part of the presentation, to explain the concept of CBAM certificates and associated costs. The CBAM Registry, or CBAM Portal, is a central online system where authorizations, certificate purchases, holdings and surrender, annual declarations and communications between the Climate Action Authority, declarants and the European Commission are managed. Access to the registry is granted via the EU Access System, and access requests are validated by the European Commission. Access can be revoked following consultation with Member States if necessary. Third country operators, that is non-EU manufacturers and suppliers of CBAM goods, can also use a dedicated interface in the registry. This allows them to publish actual emissions data and share it efficiently with all of their EU importers. This is highly recommended for a smooth and efficient transfer of actual emissions data to the EU importers and to prevent the use of default values. CBAM certificates are the core instrument used to equalize the carbon price between EU and non-EU products. One CBAM certificate corresponds to 1 ton of embedded CO2 equivalent emissions in imported goods. In contrast to the ETS cap and trade system, there is no fixed total cap on the number of CBAM certificates. The price of CBAM certificates is linked to the weekly average auction closing price of the EU ETS1 allowances. The sales of CBAM certificates will start on the 1st of February 2027. The first purchases and surrenders will relate to emissions embedded in CBAM imports for the year 2026. During 2026, the European Commission will publish ETS1-based indicative prices each quarter to provide greater predictability. To help operators estimate costs, the Climate Action Authority has developed an Excel-based calculator. The tool uses a formula that combines embedded emissions, a CBAM benchmark, the CBAM factor, the quantity of goods imported, and the CBAM certificate price. The calculation is carried out for each CN code and country of origin, and the results are summed to estimate the total CBAM costs. A guidance document is available on the CAA website to help using the calculator. These estimates are indicative only, as certificate prices are determined through the weekly auctions, and both benchmarks and default values remain provisional. The authority, therefore, cannot be held liable for decisions taken solely on the basis of these estimates. The embedded emissions represent the total greenhouse gas emissions, expressed in tons of CO2 equivalent, generated during the production of the imported goods, and including both the direct process emissions and indirect emissions from electricity use. The CBAM benchmark is the standard level of emissions assigned to a given product, reflecting the average emission levels in EU installations that is still covered by free allocations under the ETS. The CBAM factor indicates the portion of emissions still covered by free allocation in a given year, and therefore not yet subject to the CBAM charge. In 2026, for example, the factor is 97.5%, and it gradually declines until it reaches the 0% in 2034. The CBAM certificate price corresponds to the average ETS1 allowance price for a given period, and indicative values can be consulted on public financial data websites. Where a mandatory carbon price has already been paid in the country of production, for instance under a local emissions trading system, the number of CBAM certificates to be surrendered can be reduced. In such cases, the importer or producer should obtain official documentation providing the carbon price already paid, which can then be taken into account in CBAM calculations. So for embedded emissions, the operators have two options: default values or actual data. The default values are emissions factors defined by the European Commission for each CBAM product and country of production, and they include markups designed to discourage the routine use and to support the penalty framework. Actual data are emissions values based on the monitoring at installation level, provided by the manufacturer or supplier, and verified by an accredited verifier. Using default values generally leads to significantly higher CBAM costs compared to using verified actual data. And for this reason, importers are strongly encouraged to obtain emissions data from their suppliers or manufacturers, and to invite them to register on the CBAM portal so that they can share emissions data directly with all their EU importers. The CBAM factor changes over time, as free allowances under the ETS are phased out for EU producers of CBAM goods. In 2026, the factor is 97.5%. In 2027, it is set at 95%. In 2028, at 90%. And it will continue to decrease until it reaches the 0% in 2034. As the CBAM factor decreases, the number of certificates that importers must surrender increases proportionally. By 2034, free allowances for EU producers will have been fully removed, and the CBAM declarants will pay for the full amount of emissions embedded in imported CBAM goods. Now we're proceeding to the final part of the presentation, where we will be discussing annual obligations, key deadlines, and penalties. The CBAM system includes recurring obligations and deadlines each year. The annual CBAM declaration is due every year by 30th September for the previous year's imports. The first annual CBAM declaration will be due on the 30th of September 2027, covering imports for 2026. The annual declaration includes the total quantity of each CBAM good imported in tons, the country of origin, commodity goods, embedded emissions with the corresponding verification report where actual data are used, the carbon price paid abroad if applicable, and the number of certificates to be surrendered. The deadline for surrendering certificates is the same as for the annual declaration, the 30th of September of the following year. So for 2026 emissions, the certificates must therefore be surrendered by 30th September 2027. The dedicated platform for certificate management will be integrated in the CBAM Registry. After surrender, some certificates may remain unused in the declarant's account. The declarant may request repurchase of these certificates by the European Commission once per year up till the 31st of October of the following year. Repurchase is limited. In general, the Commission will only repurchase up to 50% of the number of certificates that the declarant was expected to surrender. If an importer purchased certificates because they expected to exceed the 50 tons threshold and did not exceed it by the end of the year, all such certificates may be repurchased. For 2026 related imports, certificates purchased in 2027 can only be repurchased in 2027. Certificates do not remain valid indefinitely. Each year, on the 1st of November, certificates purchased in the year before the previous year are cancelled if still unused, and no compensation is paid. So for 2026 related certificates, unused certificates will be cancelled earlier on the 1st November 2027. From 2027 onwards, a quarterly certificate holding requirement will start applying. In 2026, there is no quarterly 50% requirement. For imports in 2027 and subsequent years, authorized CBAM declarants must hold in their CBAM account by the end of each quarter certificates covering at least 50% of the cumulative embedded emissions of CBAM imports since the 1st of January. This requirement takes effect from the quarter after the 50 tons threshold has been exceeded. So, for example, if an importer reaches this threshold in the second quarter of 2028, the first check of the 50% requirement is performed at the end of the third quarter of 2028. Penalties are an important component of the CBAM system, and national subsidiary legislation will specify CBAM-related penalties in Malta. For authorized CBAM declarants, penalties may apply, for example, if they fail to surrender sufficient certificates. A penalty does not replace the obligation to surrender missing certificates. When deciding on penalties, the Climate Action Authority can consider whether the error originated from third parties, such as operators, verifiers, or entities providing carbon price documentation, and will also assess the duration, the gravity, intent, repetition, and the level of cooperation. For non-authorized declarants, penalties apply when an importer exceeds the 50 tons threshold without being authorized. In such cases, the penalty replaces the declaration and surrender obligation, because an operator outside the system cannot lawfully surrender certificates. Customs should block imports of CBAM goods from the 1st of April 2026, and the importer must still apply to become an authorized CBAM declarant. The main dates and deadlines can be summarized as follows. 31st March 2026, the temporary derogation ends for provisional importing based on an application reference number. From the 1st of April 2026, only authorized CBAM declarants may import CBAM goods. No authorization means no imports. From February 2027, the CBAM certificates may be purchased, and the first purchases will relate to 2026 emissions. From 2027 onwards, the quarterly 50% coverage checks will happen on the 31st of March, 30th of June, 30th September, and the 31st of December for that year's imports. The 30th of September is the annual CBAM declaration and certificate surrender deadline for the previous year, with the first deadline on the 30th of September 2027 for the 2026 imports. 31st October is the deadline to request the repurchase of unused certificates purchased during that year. 1st November, the cancellation of certificates purchased in the year before the previous year, if unused. For 2026 related certificates, cancellation is on the 1st of November 2027. The 30th of April is the annual threshold assessment by the Commission. Since 2026 involves temporary special rules, here's a summary for the 2026 key dates. Then, from 2027 onwards, the key dates should follow this pattern. There are several main actors involved in CBAM. Authorised CBAM declarants will submit annual declarations, the purchase and surrender certificates, arrange verification and provide evidence of carbon price paid abroad where applicable. The Climate Action Authority is the national competent authority that manages authorisations, oversees the CBAM Registry at national level, monitors compliance, applies penalties and manages appeals. The European Commission manages the central systems, validates access to the registry, publishes certificate prices, and coordinates implementation within member states. Customs authorities ensure that only authorised CBAM declarants import CBAM goods and that CBAM-related information is correctly declared in customs procedures. For more detailed information, viewers can consult the Climate Action Authority's CBAM webpage, the European Commission's CBAM website, the documents listing the provisional benchmarks and default values, guidance and the portal access for third country operators through the links provided in the presentation. This video has provided an overview of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism and how it is being implemented in Malta. The Climate Action Authority thanks viewers for their interest and invites operators to consult the CAA website and the European Commission's CBAM pages for the latest guidance and updates. Thank you.